Sienna Matthews had worked too hard to be treated like she was less than. She had built herself from the ground up, climbing the corporate ladder with relentless determination. Late nights, and sacrifices that most people would never understand. She had learned early in life that she would always have to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. To be respected, to be seen. So when she booked a first-class ticket for herself, it wasn't about luxury, it was about recognition of her own worth. It was about allowing herself a moment to enjoy the fruits of her labor. A well-earned reward for years of resilience and perseverance. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The day had started off perfectly. Sienna had arrived at the airport feeling calm and in control, dressed in a sleek, fitted navy blue pantsuit, exuding the confidence that had carried her through boardrooms and negotiations. The VIP lounge welcomed her with quiet luxury, soft leather chairs, fresh coffee, and a peaceful moment before her flight. Everything was exactly as it should be. Until it wasn't. As Sienna boarded the plane, she felt the familiar buzz of accomplishment, a moment to finally relax. She moved through the first-class cabin, locating her carefully chosen window seat. 3A. Spacious, comfortable, hers. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, slid into the plush seat, and exhaled. Finally, just as she reached for her seatbelt, a shadow loomed over her. A flight attendant. She was middle-aged, with a polite but tight-lipped smile. The kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her tone clipped but coated in artificial sweetness. "I'm going to need you to switch seats." At first, Sienna blinked, thinking she misheard. She glanced at her ticket, then back at the woman, offering a patient but firm smile. "I think there's a mistake. This is my seat." The flight attendant's smile faltered, but she didn't back down. "No mistake," she said. "We have another passenger who needs this seat." A cold knot twisted in Sienna's stomach. She followed the flight attendant's gaze and saw him. A white man in an expensive suit. Tall, confident, entitled. He was standing in the aisle. Not with confusion or frustration, but with expectation. Like he was waiting for what was rightfully his. Sienna felt a sharp sting of realization. This wasn't about a seat mix-up. It wasn't about a technical issue. It was about who they believed belonged here. And who they didn't. A slow, burning rage built in Sienna's chest. But she kept her voice measured. Steady. "I paid for this seat," she said, her eyes locked onto the flight attendant's. "I chose it. I'm not moving." The air thickened. Passengers in the surrounding seats shifted, eyes flicking toward the unfolding confrontation. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched with quiet curiosity. The businessman let out an exaggerated sigh, rubbing his temples like he was the one being inconvenienced. The flight attendant's smile disappeared altogether. "Ma'am, we're asking for your cooperation," she said, her voice dropping into something harder. Something more authoritative. Sienna inhaled slowly, her fingers curling into fists against her lap. There it was. The unspoken rule she had seen too many times before. They weren't asking, they were telling. They expected her to comply without question. To be grateful for the opportunity to give up something she had rightfully earned, for someone they saw as more deserving. Her blood roared in her ears. But she didn't flinch. "I'm not moving," she repeated. "If this passenger wants a better seat, he can take it up with the airline, not with me." The businessman scoffed, finally stepping forward. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's just a seat." Sienna turned, leveling him with a gaze so sharp it could cut through steel. "If it's just a seat," she said coolly, "why don't you sit somewhere else?" Silence. The murmurs around them grew. A woman across the aisle, an older lady with salt and pepper hair, tilted her head and frowned. "She's right," she said, speaking to no one in particular. "Why should she have to move?" The flight attendant's cheeks darkened, frustration flickering across her face. "Ma'am," she tried again, her voice strained, "we have policies that allow us to reassign seats if necessary. It's just a minor request." Sienna felt the weight of those words. Minor. A lifetime of experiences just like this one had taught her that these moments were never minor. It was in the job interviews where she was overlooked. It was in the boardrooms where she had to prove herself twice over. It was in the quiet, suffocating moments where people told her, in 1,000 different ways, that she wasn't supposed to be here. And now, they wanted her to shrink again. To move aside like she was nothing more than an afterthought. Not today. Not anymore. Sienna straightened her back, letting the power of her voice fill the space. No, she said. Clear, strong, unshaken. The businessman let out an irritated chuckle. But now he looked uncomfortable. The murmurs in the cabin had grown louder, too many witnesses now. Too many people watching. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. I'll be right back, she said stiffly before marching toward the front of the plane. Sienna didn't move. She refused to lower her eyes. Refused to let them make her feel small. She knew this wasn't over. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly predict, was that her decision to stand firm in this moment would set off a chain reaction. A firestorm of consequences that would shake the entire airline industry to its core. But right now, Sienna wasn't thinking about that. Right now, she was thinking about every time she had swallowed her pride. Every time she had let something go to keep the peace. She had done enough of that in her life. Not this time. Not today. She tightened her grip on the armrests. Took a slow breath. And waited. Let's see what happens next. Sienna Matthews knew what was coming next. She could feel the shift in energy around her, the discomfort. The growing impatience. The subtle expectation that she would fold. Because that's how these situations always went. Didn't they? Someone like her, a black woman who had worked relentlessly to carve out space for herself, was expected to be polite. Compliant. Agreeable. She had learned, over the years, that people didn't like when women like her took up space. They didn't like when she held her ground. Refused to shrink. Refused to smile and just go along with it. And yet, there she was. Still in her seat. Unmoving. Unshaken. Waiting. The growing pressure. The flight attendant had disappeared toward the front of the plane. But Sienna knew she wasn't done. She was getting reinforcements. The murmurs around her grew louder. Some passengers whispered in hushed voices. Their expressions unreadable. Others openly stared, their gazes flickering between her and the empty space where the flight attendant had stood just moments before. And then there were the few, the ones who had already decided she was the problem. A man 2 rows behind her let out a loud sigh. Shifting in his seat. Can we just take off already? He muttered. Clearly irritated. She's making a big deal out of nothing. Sienna's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn around. Because she had heard those words before. They were always used to silence people like her. To make her feel like she was the one causing trouble. Like her mere existence in a space where she had every right to be was an inconvenience. But she didn't move. She wouldn't. Because this wasn't just about a seat anymore. The supervisor arrives. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, and this time, she wasn't alone. A middle-aged man in a navy blue airline uniform followed behind her. His posture stiff, his expression carefully controlled. He had the look of a man who had dealt with situations before, and believed he was about to handle this one with quick, authoritative efficiency. Sienna felt a familiar wave of frustration rise in her chest. She already knew exactly how this would go. They would tell her this was a misunderstanding. They would try to reframe the situation. Make it sound like it was just an issue of logistics, of procedures, and company policy. But she had spent too many years in boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed, minimized, explained away. She could see right through it. And she wasn't going to let it happen. The supervisor stopped beside her row, glancing down with a forced smile. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but firm, measured in a way that told her he was trying to sound reasonable. Accommodating. "We understand there's been a bit of confusion here," he continued, "but I'd like to ask for your cooperation." Sienna raised an eyebrow, keeping her expression calm. "Confusion?" she echoed. The supervisor's smile tightened. "The other passenger," he gestured vaguely toward the man in the business suit, who was now watching with a look of barely contained irritation, "needs this seat due to an urgent scheduling conflict. We're asking you to move as a courtesy." Sienna inhaled slowly, choosing her next words carefully. "I see," she said, tilting her head slightly. "So he needs my seat?" "Yes. And I assume he also paid for a seat?" The supervisor blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, of course. Then why isn't he sitting in it?" A flicker of irritation flashed across the supervisor's face. But he recovered quickly. "Ma'am, we sometimes have to make last-minute adjustments for priority passengers." Sienna let the words sink in. Priority passengers. There it was. A quiet but deliberate way of saying, He matters more than you do. She exhaled, feeling a slow burn of anger rise in her chest. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she kept her voice steady. Controlled. Tell me something, she said. Would you be asking me to move if I looked like him? The supervisor hesitated. And in that moment, she knew. The crowd reacts. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. A woman across the aisle, someone who had been silently watching up until now, suddenly leaned forward. She's right, the woman said, her voice cutting through the quiet. She paid for that seat. Why should she have to move? A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. The businessman shifted uncomfortably. The supervisor glanced toward the flight attendant, as if silently pleading for support. More voices joined in. This doesn't seem fair. She has a point. Just let her keep her seat. Sienna felt the energy shift. The tide was turning. Because people were watching now. Because she had forced them to see it. The supervisor's final attempt. The supervisor exhaled sharply, his polite demeanor beginning to crack. Ma'am, he said, his voice clipped now. If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to involve security. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Sienna held his gaze. She could feel her heart pounding. Feel the weight of every moment in her life where she had been told to sit down. To stay quiet. To just accept things as they were. But she had already made up her mind. Go ahead, she said, never breaking eye contact. The supervisor stiffened. The businessman's face turned a shade of red. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. They had expected her to back down. She didn't. Because this wasn't just about this one moment. This was about all the moments that had come before it. The ones where she had bit her tongue, smiled through it, let it go. Not this time. The moment that changed everything. The supervisor hesitated for a long moment. His mind racing. Security? Risk a bigger scene? A legal complaint? A viral video? He exhaled slowly. Fine, he muttered. Keep your seat. The tension in the cabin broke like a dam. The businessman turned away sharply, muttering under his breath. The flight attendant avoided Sienna's eyes as she hurried off. And Sienna? She sat back, unapologetic, unmoved, unbroken, because she had won. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly predict, was that this moment was only the beginning. Because when she got off that plane, everything would change. Sienna Matthews had won the battle on the plane. But the war was just beginning. As she stepped off the jet bridge, her legs felt like stone. The entire flight, she had sat stiffly in her seat, refusing to let herself relax, refusing to let herself believe the ordeal was truly over. Even as the plane had lifted into the sky, the weight of what had happened sat heavy on her chest, pressing down on her ribs like an iron fist. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about what the seat represented. Her right to exist in a space she had paid for. Her right to be treated with the same respect as any other passenger. Her right to not be made to feel small. And now, standing in the bright, bustling airport terminal, she knew she couldn't just let this go. The call that changed everything. As soon as she reached baggage claim, she pulled out her phone and called the airline's corporate customer service. A robotic voice guided her through an endless series of options before she was finally connected to a representative. Thank you for calling customer service. How may I assist you today? Sienna inhaled, steadying herself. She needed to stay calm, measured. I'm calling to report a case of discriminatory treatment by your airline staff. I was asked to vacate my paid first-class seat, without any valid reason. When I refused, I was threatened with security removal. A long pause. I'm sorry to hear about that, the representative said, her tone detached, uninterested. Let me pull up your flight details and file a report. Sienna's jaw clenched. She knew this script. She had dealt with this exact tone before, the one that meant nothing would come of this. She wouldn't let them sweep this under the rug. I expect more than just a report, she said, her voice firm but controlled. I want a direct response from corporate leadership. Another pause. I understand, ma'am. We'll escalate this and someone will reach out in 7 to 10 business days. Sienna's stomach twisted. 10 days? They wanted her to wait? After everything they had put her through? After the way they had tried to strip her of her dignity? No. She had been silent too many times before. She wouldn't be silent now. Going public. The moment she ended the call, she opened her social media. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. She knew the risks. She knew there would be backlash. People would say she was overreacting. People would say she was playing the victim. People would say she should have just cooperated and moved. But she also knew that her story was not just her own. This had happened before. It would happen again, unless someone forced them to acknowledge it. She started typing. Imagine paying for a first-class seat, settling in, and being told, without reason, that you have to move. Not asked. Told. Imagine refusing, because you paid for your seat just like everyone else, only to be met with thinly veiled threats. Imagine realizing, in that moment, that the only difference between you and the person they wanted to replace you with was the color of your skin. That was my reality today. And it's the reality for so many of us. Every day. This has to stop. Enough is enough. #flying while black. She hesitated for only a second before pressing post. Within minutes, the notifications started rolling in. People were watching, and they were angry. The firestorm erupts. By the time Sienna got home that night, her phone was on fire. Her post had gone viral. Thousands of people had liked, commented, and shared it. Her inbox was flooded with messages from strangers, some telling her they had experienced the same thing. Others thanking her for speaking up. And then the media came. A journalist reached out within hours. "Ms. Matthews, we'd love to hear more about your experience. Would you be willing to do an interview?" Sienna hesitated. She wasn't someone who sought out attention. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She owed it to everyone who had been forced to endure this in silence. "Yes," she said, "I'll talk." Corporate panic. The airline wasn't ready for the backlash. Their social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. "Why hasn't the airline responded to this yet? This is disgusting. Do better. I won't be flying with you again until you fix this." The company's damage control team scrambled. They issued a generic apology statement. "We take these allegations seriously and are conducting an internal review." But it was too late. The story had caught fire. Sienna watched as more and more people shared their own stories. A black father tweeted about being forced to prove he paid for his first-class seat. A Latina woman posted about being moved from her assigned seat for operational reasons, only to find her original seat reassigned to a white passenger. The floodgates had opened, and the airline was drowning. The turning point. 3 days after her post went viral, Sienna's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Matthews, this is the Vice President of Customer Relations at the airline. We'd like to formally apologize and discuss a resolution." Sienna's stomach tightened. Now that the world was watching, they wanted to talk. They wanted to contain the damage. But she wasn't interested in their empty PR statements. "If you're really sorry," she said, her voice unwavering, "then let's talk about change." A long silence. Then, "We'd like to set up a meeting with senior leadership." The fight continues. Sienna knew this was far from over. She had forced them to listen. But now, she had to make them act. She wasn't just seeking an apology. She was demanding accountability, policy changes, training, real consequences. Because this fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel invisible. For every person who had been told to move, to stay silent, to make themselves small. Not anymore. This was just the beginning. And she would not back down. What happens next? What Sienna did took courage. She spoke up when it would have been easier to let it go. She fought when the world expected her to stay quiet. And now, change was coming. But will the airline truly fix their mistakes? Or will they do what companies always do? Make empty promises and hope people forget? Stay tuned, because this story isn't over yet. Sienna is just getting started. Sienna Matthews had spent years navigating spaces where she had to fight to be seen, to be respected, to be treated as an equal. But never had she imagined that one moment on an airplane, one refusal to shrink, would ignite something far bigger than herself. It started as a ripple, a few comments of support, a few shared experiences, but soon, the ripple turned into a tidal wave. The world was watching now. And for the first time, the airline was afraid. The internet erupts. A movement begins. By the time Sienna woke up the next morning, her phone was buzzing non-stop. She had gone to bed with a few hundred shares on her post. Now, it was in the tens of thousands. Hashtags were trending. #flying while black. #we see you. #do better. Strangers from around the world were rallying behind her. This is why we need change. One person tweeted, My father was forced off a plane for questioning his seat assignment. He had the receipt. That didn't matter. Thank you, Sienna, for speaking up. This is what black travelers deal with every single day. Enough is enough. It was no longer just about her story. It was about everyone who had ever been humiliated, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. And now? They weren't staying silent anymore. The backlash against the airline. While Sienna's inbox flooded with messages of support, the airline was getting the opposite. Their social media pages? Overrun. Hundreds of thousands of comments. Passengers canceling their flights. Boycotts. One by one, major influencers and activists joined in. I fly first class all the time. And this has never happened to me. One influencer with 3 million followers posted. Wonder why? At airline. Care to explain? Celebrities spoke out. News outlets picked up the story. And suddenly, the airline was drowning in a PR crisis of their own making. Corporate panic mode. Inside the airline's headquarters, chaos erupted. Executives scrambled into emergency meetings. Phones rang off the hook. We need a statement. Someone barked in the boardroom. Now, an intern, shaking as he read the live updates, whispered, "There are already petitions calling for boycotts." The CEO sat stiffly at the end of the table. His jaw clenched. "This is bigger than bad press," he muttered. "This is a disaster." By noon, the airline released a statement. "We take these concerns seriously and are conducting a full investigation. We value all our customers and do not condone discrimination in any form." It was vague, generic, meaningless, and the internet saw right through it. Investigating? We saw what happened. Do better. This isn't just about Sienna. This is systemic. An apology without action is worthless. The airline had underestimated just how powerful the public's voice could be. And now? They were paying for it. Advocacy groups step in. Before the day was over, major civil rights organizations entered the conversation. One group, known for exposing racial injustices in corporate America, issued a scathing statement. The treatment of Ms. Matthews is a painful reflection of what black travelers have endured for years. We demand a full review of the airline's policies, mandatory anti-bias training, and immediate accountability for those responsible. Other organizations joined in. Lawsuits were threatened. Government officials started asking questions. And the FAA, the very agency overseeing air travel regulations, issued a public response. The pressure was mounting. And Sienna? She wasn't backing down. A personal toll. But as the firestorm grew, so did the ugly side of the internet. The attacks came. Racist messages flooded her inbox. "Stop playing the victim. Maybe you should have just moved. You people always make everything about race." Sienna took a deep breath. Staring at the screen, she knew this would happen. She was prepared for it. Because this wasn't about a seat. This was about demanding the right to exist in spaces she had every right to be in. Still, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. She was tired, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. The moment of reckoning. 2 days later, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Matthews, this is the head of customer relations for the airline. We'd like to have a conversation." Now they wanted to talk. Sienna's fingers tightened around the phone. "I already made myself clear," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me. I want real change." A pause. "We're prepared to discuss that." She didn't trust them, but she knew this was a battle she had to see through. "Then let's talk." The fight for change continues. Sienna didn't just want a private apology. She wanted policy reform. She wanted diversity training. She wanted real accountability. And when she stepped into that corporate office for the meeting, she brought thousands of voices with her. She wasn't alone. Because people stood with her. Because people believed her. And because when one person refuses to back down, it gives others the strength to do the same. Why this matters? Sienna's story isn't just her own. It's for every person who has been dismissed. For every person told to move. To be quiet. To just let it go. No more. We won't stay silent. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, if you believe in holding corporations accountable, like this post, comment below to show support. Share this story. Because our voices matter. And together, we will make them listen. The pressure had become too great to ignore. For days, the airline had tried to contain the fire. But with every passing hour, it only grew bigger. This wasn't just a PR nightmare, this was a full-blown crisis. And at the center of it all was one woman who refused to be silenced. Sienna Matthews. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a politician. She was simply a woman who had been wronged. And she had the courage to say no. The investigation begins. Corporate executives huddled in their boardrooms, their expensive suits feeling a little tighter than usual as they scrambled to find a way out of the mess. "We need to fix this, or we're finished," one of them muttered. "The public is furious. We need to issue another statement." "No," another voice snapped. "We need an internal investigation. We need to make it look like we're actually doing something." And so, they announced it. "We take these allegations seriously. We are conducting a thorough internal review." Empty words. A desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But the public wasn't buying it. Neither was Sienna. More stories. More evidence. As the investigation began, something unexpected happened. More people started coming forward. Flight attendants, former employees, even pilots. One anonymous whistleblower spoke to the press. "This isn't new. I've seen it happen before." The unspoken rule was always the same. Some passengers get priority. Others? Just move them. The truth was coming out. Sienna's experience was not an isolated case. This was systemic. And the airline knew it. The first domino falls. Then came the first big announcement. The flight attendant and supervisor who had tried to remove Sienna. Fired. The company framed it as necessary disciplinary action. But everyone knew the truth. They were scapegoats. The airline wanted to pin it all on them. Pretend that firing a few people would make the problem disappear. But Sienna wasn't satisfied. And neither was the public. The CEO's forced apology. After relentless pressure, the CEO had no choice but to break his silence. A press conference was called. Cameras flashed. The world watched. He stepped up to the podium, his face carefully composed. "We deeply regret the events that took place. We acknowledge that there were failures in our system. We are committed to doing better." Sienna sat at home, watching. And for the first time in days, she laughed. Not out of amusement, out of disbelief. "That's it," she muttered. Not once had he actually said her name. Not once had he actually taken real responsibility. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. Social media exploded. Say her name. An apology without action is nothing. If you're really committed to change, prove it. Pushed into real action. With the world still watching, the airline had no choice. They had to do more. So, under immense public pressure, they announced sweeping changes. Mandatory bias training for all employees. An independent oversight board to handle discrimination complaints. A passenger rights charter, guaranteeing fair treatment for all travelers. It was a victory. But Sienna wasn't celebrating yet. Because policies meant nothing if no one enforced them. A personal toll. Behind closed doors, Sienna was exhausted. She had spent days fighting. She had endured hate messages, threats, and attacks. People called her a liar, a troublemaker, a race baiter. But she had also received thousands of messages of support. From people who had lived her experience. From mothers, fathers, students, professionals. People who knew exactly what it felt like to be treated as less. And it was those voices that gave her the strength to keep going. A moment of triumph. A week later, Sienna received an email. It wasn't from a lawyer. It wasn't from a journalist. It was from a mother. "I just wanted to say thank you. My teenage daughter saw what happened to you and told me, 'Mom, this is why we have to speak up.' You showed her that standing up for yourself isn't just possible, it's necessary. You're changing lives. You're inspiring people. And for that, I just wanted to say, thank you." Sienna felt tears in her eyes. Not because of the stress. Not because of the exhaustion. But because, for the first time, she truly understood the impact of her fight. This is bigger than one airline. The fight wasn't just about one company. This was about all industries. It was about every place where people were told to be quiet. Where they were told to accept less. Sienna had proved something powerful. When you stand up, when you refuse to back down, when you demand to be seen, people listen. And change? It happens. What happens next? This isn't over. The airline is making promises, but will they keep them? Will they actually follow through? Or will they hope the public forgets? Sienna is watching. We are watching. And if they think this will fade away, they're wrong. Because we won't let them. Join the movement. If you believe in standing up for what's right. If you believe this fight isn't over yet. Comment below. Tell Sienna she's not alone. Tell the airline we are watching. Tell the world we will not be silent. Like, share, stand up. Together, we make them listen. Sienna Matthews never set out to change an entire industry. She just wanted fair treatment, to sit in the seat she paid for. To be treated with dignity. To travel without feeling like she had to fight for her existence. But sometimes, one act of defiance becomes a spark. And that spark can ignite a revolution. A call for change that couldn't be ignored. The airline had buckled under pressure, firing employees and announcing new policies. But the public wasn't satisfied. This wasn't just about one airline. People had watched Sienna's story unfold. And now, they were sharing their own. A black pilot came forward, revealing how he had been mistaken for a baggage handler twice. A Latina flight attendant shared how she was paid less than her white colleagues despite working the same hours. A father recalled how his teenage son was forced to prove he belonged in first class, while other passengers simply walked in without question. The floodgates had opened, and suddenly, airlines everywhere were forced to listen. Mandatory bias training becomes industry standard. Faced with mounting pressure, multiple airlines scrambled to act. One by one, they announced mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, from flight attendants to corporate executives. Diversity audits to track hiring, promotions, and customer interactions. New passenger protection policies, ensuring no one could be moved from their seat unfairly. Airlines that had once dismissed these issues were now racing to address them. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. Because Sienna made it impossible for them to stay silent. The birth of independent oversight boards. For years, passenger complaints about discrimination went nowhere. People were brushed off, ignored, told, "We're sorry for the inconvenience." But now, there was nowhere to hide. Consumer advocacy groups pushed for real oversight. And under immense pressure, airlines created independent review boards, outside organizations that investigated complaints fairly. Whistleblower protections for employees who reported discrimination. A zero-tolerance policy, ensuring those who violated equity policies were held accountable. For the first time ever, airlines couldn't police themselves. And that was a game-changer. Other industries start taking notes. What started in the airline industry spread like wildfire. Hotel chains began reviewing their check-in policies after travelers of color reported being asked for extra verification. Luxury brands trained their staff after multiple high-profile cases of racial profiling in upscale stores. Rideshare companies launched internal reviews after complaints of drivers refusing to pick up black passengers. Sienna's stand had sent shockwaves far beyond the skies. Her courage had forced industries to confront what they had ignored for too long. A victory, but not the end. Months after the incident, a journalist asked Sienna, "How does it feel to know you changed an industry?" Sienna's response was simple. The fight isn't over. Because policies mean nothing if no one enforces them. Because bias training doesn't erase racism overnight. Because one victory doesn't mean the battle is won. Sienna wasn't done watching. And neither were we. The power of one voice. Sienna never wanted to be a symbol. She was just a woman who refused to move. And yet, that simple act sparked a movement. A movement that forced billion-dollar industries to change. A movement that empowered thousands to speak up. And a movement that proved one thing. When you demand justice, people listen. Her story is not just hers. It belongs to all of us. And now, it's our turn to keep pushing for change. If you believe in justice, if you believe in accountability, comment below. Share this story. Because the fight isn't over. And together, we will make them listen. When Elisha Carter boarded her flight that day, she had no idea she was about to become the face of a national movement. She just wanted to sit in the seat she paid for and enjoy a peaceful journey. But when she was asked, no, expected, to move for the convenience of someone deemed more important, she refused. That single act of defiance would transform her life, ignite a firestorm of outrage, and set off a movement far greater than anyone imagined. A platform born from injustice. At first, Elisha had no intention of becoming an activist. She was exhausted by the public scrutiny, the interviews, the endless social media messages. Some people called her brave. Others called her a troublemaker. She was receiving both threats and praise in equal measure. But as she read through thousands of messages, something shifted in her. She saw messages from people who had faced the same discrimination but had no platform to speak out. Elisha, this happened to me too. But I didn't have the courage to fight back. Thank you for standing up for yourself. You're standing up for all of us. Because of you, my daughter now knows that she never has to accept less than what she deserves. Elisha realized something powerful. This wasn't just her fight. This was bigger than her. And she couldn't let it end with just an apology from an airline. She had to do more. Your voice, your power, a movement begins. Determined to make lasting change, Elisha launched a campaign. Your voice, your power. The mission? To teach people how to stand up against discrimination in public spaces. To provide legal resources for those who experience racial bias in travel and service industries. To push for stronger protections against discrimination in air travel, hotels, and retail. The campaign took off like wildfire. People shared their stories under the hashtag. Lawyers and activists volunteered to help victims file official complaints. Within weeks, thousands had joined the movement. Within months, it had reached international audiences. Elisha wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for millions. Congress takes notice. The movement grew so large that it reached Washington, D.C. Civil rights organizations demanded legislative action. Lawmakers began debating new anti-discrimination laws for the airline industry. Proposals were put forth. Mandatory bias training for all airline employees. Harsher penalties for racial discrimination in customer service industries. An independent federal oversight board for discrimination complaints. Elisha was invited to testify before Congress. As she sat before a panel of lawmakers, cameras flashing, she felt the weight of everyone she represented. She took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. No one should have to fight this hard just to be treated with basic human dignity. If I hadn't had the platform I do, my story would have been ignored, just like countless others before me. We need protections, not just promises. We need change. Her words were broadcast across the country. And for the first time, people were asking, how many times has this happened without anyone knowing? Seating arrangements. Fighting for the space you deserve. As the movement gained traction, publishers approached Elisha with book deals. At first, she hesitated. She had never considered herself an author, just someone who had been wronged. But she realized that her story wasn't just hers to tell. It was the story of millions of people who had been silenced, ignored, dismissed. And so, she began writing. Her book, Seating Arrangements, Fighting for the Space You Deserve, was more than a memoir. It was a call to action. She detailed the systemic discrimination in travel and customer service, the importance of knowing your rights, the power of speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable. The book became a bestseller. It was taught in universities. It was used in corporate diversity training. It was a resource for anyone who had ever been told to just let it go. The critics and the courage. Of course, with every movement comes resistance. Elisha's success made her a target. There were backlash articles calling her a troublemaker and a race baiter. Some claimed she was blowing things out of proportion. Others accused her of seeking attention. But Elisha? She didn't flinch. Because she knew the truth. She wasn't fighting for fame. She was fighting for a world where no one had to question if they belonged. And she refused to back down. A legacy of strength. Elisha's journey wasn't just about one moment on a plane. It was about changing an industry. It was about empowering others to use their voice. And most of all, it was about proving that one person can make a difference. Her story became a symbol of courage. A reminder that you don't have to be famous to create change. You don't have to be powerful to be heard. You just have to refuse to accept injustice. And now, the fight continues. The laws are still being debated. The airline industry is still under scrutiny. And people are still watching. Join the movement. Elisha's fight wasn't just for her. It was for all of us. If you believe in justice, if you believe in equal treatment, if you believe that no one should be forced to fight for a seat they rightfully paid for, comment below with, I stand with Elisha. Share this story to keep the conversation alive. Follow the campaign hashtag Your Voice Your Power to stay updated. Because change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we stand up. speak out, and refuse to back down. Will you be part of it? The journey of Elisha Carter did not just end with an apology from an airline or a viral story that circulated the globe. No, her stand against injustice was only the beginning of something much bigger. What started as an infuriating and humiliating experience on a flight became a movement. A catalyst for change that reached far beyond the confines of that one airplane cabin. It sparked conversations, ignited a national debate, and reminded the world that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. When Elisha refused to give up her seat, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, overlooked, and told that their concerns weren't valid. She became the voice for those who had suffered in silence, for those who had been wronged but lacked the platform to demand accountability. And the impact of her bravery spread like wildfire. The movement grows. As Elisha's story gained traction, it became more than just a personal battle, it was a movement. Advocacy groups rallied behind her, demanding that airlines revise their policies to prevent racial and social discrimination. The hashtag Your Voice Your Power campaign exploded across social media, amassing millions of shares, comments, and personal testimonials from individuals who had faced similar injustices. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, lawmakers began addressing the deeply ingrained discrimination within customer service industries. Particularly in air travel, legislation was proposed to establish independent oversight committees to investigate discrimination complaints, ensuring that passengers like Elisha would never again have to rely on the same companies that wronged them to seek justice. New policies were enacted that required airlines to publicly report instances of bias-related incidents, hold employees accountable for discriminatory practices, and ensure proper training for staff in handling racial bias appropriately. Elisha herself became a national figure in the fight for consumer rights. She was invited to speak at universities, corporate diversity summits, and even testify before Congress. What started as a single unjust moment had grown into a pivotal movement for equity, justice, and corporate accountability. The critics and the challenges. With success, however, came backlash. Not everyone celebrated Elisha's courage. Critics emerged, dismissing her experience as an overreaction. Some claimed she was playing the victim or exaggerating the issue for attention. Others accused her of trying to profit from the situation, stating that airlines have always had the right to make seating adjustments. But Elisha never let the negativity shake her. She knew that change never comes without resistance. Every great movement in history, from civil rights to women's suffrage, faced opposition from those who benefited from the status quo. Rather than cower, she stood taller. Rather than shrink, she spoke louder. She reminded the world that her fight was not about personal gain, it was about justice for all. It was about ensuring that no traveler, no customer, no person was ever forced to fight for the dignity and respect they should already be afforded. Turning pain into power. Through it all, Elisha turned her experience into a force for good. She launched the Seating Arrangements Initiative, an organization dedicated to providing legal assistance to individuals who have been discriminated against in public spaces. Particularly in travel, her nonprofit connected victims of racial profiling with legal representation, fought for policy changes in airlines, hotels, and other industries, and educated consumers on their rights. Her book, Seating Arrangements: Fighting for the Space You Deserve, became a bestseller, detailing not only her personal battle but also providing practical guidance on how to navigate and challenge systemic discrimination in travel and customer service industries. Schools began using it in their curriculum to teach students about racial bias, consumer rights, and the importance of speaking up. But Elisha didn't stop there. She partnered with corporate executives who were willing to listen and take action, advising businesses on how to implement truly inclusive policies and training their employees to recognize and eliminate unconscious bias. Her influence extended into boardrooms, where she helped rewrite policies that had long enabled discriminatory practices. A legacy of change. Months after the incident, Elisha stood before a crowd of thousands at a civil rights summit, reflecting on the journey that had brought her there. With a steady voice, she declared, "Change begins with one person who refuses to step back. We cannot wait for someone else to fix the problems we see. We must demand change. We must be the change." Her speech went viral, inspiring the new generation to stand up for their rights. She had gone from a woman wronged on a flight to a leader, an advocate, a warrior for justice. Today, her work continues, and her fight has become a global mission. But Alicia's story is more than just a cautionary tale about discrimination. It is a testament to the power of standing firm. What we can learn from Alicia's story. Alicia's journey teaches us invaluable lessons that apply to our everyday lives. Never let anyone silence you. If you see injustice, speak up. You have the right to be treated with respect. No matter the situation, your voice is powerful. One person can spark a movement. You don't need to be famous, rich, or in a position of power to make a difference. You just need courage. Change starts when we refuse to accept mistreatment. Systems don't change on their own, people demand change. If we continue to let unfairness slide, we allow it to continue. Support those who stand for justice. It's not enough to admire from the sidelines, be part of the change. Sign petitions, support advocacy groups, amplify stories of injustice, and stand with those who fight back. Never back down from what is right. The road to justice is never easy, and there will always be those who resist progress. But standing up for fairness and equity is always worth it. Join the movement. Alicia's fight wasn't just for her. It was for all of us. If you believe in justice, if you believe in equal treatment, if you believe that no one should be forced to fight for a seat they rightfully paid for, comment below with, "I stand with Alicia." Share this story to keep the conversation alive. Follow the campaign #YourVoiceYourPower to stay updated. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and change. Because change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down. Will you be part of it?